very pleased with the deep dive that they took. We will have that published report prepared and ready for you probably in another couple of weeks. So today you'll hear how they approached the project, the data they found, and give you some policy recommendations for your discussion tonight. So, Jenny and Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you, Robin. I'm going to start off, we're going to do a tag team here, and I'll see if I can advance these slides. Can you hear me? So as Robin said, we were, commissioned by the Boulder County Consortium of Cities to determine the need for new permanent supportive housing units and opportunities throughout Boulder County, and to identify barriers and opportunities to meet those needs. One of the things that this study doesn't do is look at overall homeless needs throughout Boulder County. This is specific to permanent supportive housing. And really those other types of housing for homeless people might be short-term shelter or transitional housing that are provided to people while they get back on their feet. We're really looking at programs that are more like Lee Hill and Boulder, the suites in Longmont, some of the permanent supportive housing voucher programs that are already offered through the county. To prepare our study, we conducted an extensive interview process with homeless and service providers. We talked to housing agencies, local government planners, and other key stakeholders in all communities throughout the county as a kickoff. We then reviewed multiple data sources related to the number of homeless people in Boulder County, the types of issues that they were dealing with, some of the deep dive into who were actually chronically homeless individuals versus just homeless individuals, and then we tried to provide a demographic profile of chronically homeless people in Boulder County. We tabulated all current permanent supportive housing opportunities that are available throughout the county, that are already offered. We reviewed the comprehensive plans and land use regulations of each jurisdiction throughout the county, including Boulder County, and looked at those to determine if there were any barriers to providing permanent supportive housing. We looked at the housing market and housing costs and tried to determine what barriers are in the market to providing permanent supportive housing to these chronically homeless people. We provided and created sample development scenarios, broad development scenarios that can be used as ideas for moving forward with various different types of projects that we talk about in the report, and we'll give you an overview of tonight. And really we've summarized our recommendations for moving forward in a coordinated effort between all the communities throughout the county, and come up with some recommendations for those strategies for moving forward. So, what is permanent supportive housing? Permanent supportive housing uses a housing first model and centers on providing homeless people with housing quickly and providing services as needed to those people. It's meant to avoid long stays at shelter or other short-term housing facilities that could cause further destabilization of individuals. The idea really is to get someone living in a housing unit and then wrap them with services. It's designed to meet the long-term housing and service needs of chronically homeless individuals and families. It's not transitional housing. It has no time limits, and there's no expectations that people are going to get better or get back to work and move out at a certain time frame. That could happen, but people who are targeted for permanent supportive housing, really the idea is that they're stabilized, they can stay in a unit, and they have the services that they need to live independently as much as they can. Gets us to what is chronic homelessness. And this study, again, really looks at chronic homelessness, not just anyone who's homeless. A chronically homeless individual is an individual, according to HUD, who has a disability and lives either in a place not meant for human habitation, a safe haven, an emergency shelter, or they may be in an institutional care facility. They have to have been living in these places continually for at least 12 months or on at least 4 separate occasions in the last 3 years, and it's when the combined occasions total a length of time of at least 12 months. So it's kind of a detailed definitions between providers vary somewhat, but this is the definition that's used by HUD, who provides a lot of the funding for many of the programs that are used to serve people. Chronically homeless families. While we're not going to dive too deeply into families and youth, we did touch on them in this report because they definitely have needs for permanent supportive housing and are other populations that need permanent supportive housing. And chronically homeless families are a family where the head of the household or an adult household member has the issues of an individual with chronic homelessness. They may have their children with them, they may have lost their children, they may be a household that's children have grown, but they're a family, and the adults are dealing with the same issues as individuals. Youth on their own also meet the definition of a chronically homeless family if they are the head of their household. One of the first things that we did is try to determine how many people are chronically homeless in Boulder County. And there are a variety of ways that people are counting homeless people in Boulder County. There are panels, there are groups that are coming together, there are data systems, and so we really culled through all of that and tried to determine who is really chronically homeless. And so this chart shows you some of the sources of data and the numbers that we came up with from those sources. They're not a span of people, it's not a range from 50 to 225. These are really different pots that we looked at with various reasons for pulling these data sets together. First is the high utilizers. This comes from the C4 group, the Complex Client Community Collaborative, that's made up of Boulder Shelter, Bridge House, Clinica Family Health Clinic, emergency room health staff, jail and detox staff, and other providers. And this number of 50 really represents the people who are high flyers. They utilize services a lot in Boulder County, and they've been identified as the people that are the highest utilizers of all those services and therefore the highest cost. HMIS is the Homeless Management Information System. That's a data system that was created to respond to HUD. It collects data for programs that use HUD funding. And what we did is we gathered information on people who are in the HMIS data system who live in Boulder County and who are not receiving any housing support other than short-term housing, but are also chronically homeless. And these people, not every organization uses HMIS, which is why this number is small. Not everyone who is chronically homeless is going to end up in the HMIS system. But these people are being served by some HUD-funded program, by like an emergency shelter or a transitional housing program. The panel, the number 120, is a group of Boulder providers, and it's specific to Boulder County. It's technically called the Boulder County Community Housing Resource Panel, and it's a larger group than the C4. I think it's 7 organizations, right? And then other multiple organizations that feed into those 7 that take referrals for homeless services from throughout the county. I think last year the panel processed 400 households for housing and services, and that could be for a short-term housing, long-term housing, and wraparound services that they need. The panel determined that there are approximately 120 households coming through that system every year who are chronically homeless, mostly individuals. Then we have the point in time. That's an annual point in time count. You may have heard of it. It's a homeless count throughout the country, throughout the Metro Denver, and specific to Boulder. In 2015, there were 117 chronically homeless people counted in one night. So that's a one-time shot count of anyone who has come through the shelters, come to a homeless organization being served that day. Volunteers go out and count in parks and streets, places where they know that people gather. And in 2015, the count was 117, which is pretty much around where it's been for the last few years.
And that's for Boulder County.
And that's for Boulder County, right? Yeah, sorry. Then the best count, or number that we have is called VI SPDAT, and that is the Vulnerability Index Service Prioritization and Decision Assistance Tool. I have to read it. It is considered the best count of chronically homeless people in the county, and it's a system of intake that's starting to be used throughout the country and is being used in the Metro Denver area now more and more. It doesn't necessarily count everyone. If someone isn't VI SPDATed, they're not going to get in there, and I know homeless providers wanted us to note that there are people who could really use permanent supportive housing that get filtered out of the chronic homeless definition through that system. The bar is so high for disability and need that there are other people who could use a permanent supportive housing solution that aren't in that 225. But that 225 is a one-shot, one-time, best case number. It comes from April, I think, of the people throughout Boulder County who are permanently homeless. So this is just kind of our snapshot of, how many do we have? 225 or more is what we're saying in our report. Next, we looked at some characteristics. We used the VI SPDAT data, HMIS data, and some other local data that gave us a breakdown of who people are. And some of the interesting points, most of the people who are chronically homeless have been homeless continuously for at least a year. The average number of months that they've been homeless is almost 28, so 2 years, 4 months. Their average age is 44, and almost a quarter of them are over 55 years of age. So a lot of people, I think of chronically homeless people maybe as youth, as individual youth, but really nationwide, chronically homeless people tend to be older. And as is the case nationwide, the majority are male. Through those data sources, we were also able to look at where chronically homeless people are staying throughout the county. As you can see, about a third of them are staying in shelters, and the other 2/3 are staying on the street, sidewalks, doorways, bars, parks, and anywhere else they may be hiding. So 2/3 are not in a shelter. And a lot of times, that's because they're leery of shelters. They may not want to go in a shelter, they may not want to follow shelter rules or have a problem with some of the following shelter rules. So, I think this is kind of an interesting slide to show you that 2/3 are not in the shelter system. As we mentioned, chronically homeless people have a disability. This slide gets at what some of those issues are. These are self-reported issues. I think it's through the VI SPDAT. 84% have problems with drug or alcohol. 56 have been treated for drug or alcohol problems. Over half have a mental health hospitalization. You can see ER visits is over 60%. And then most have emotional, physical, and sexual trauma. Obviously, these issues are costly to the citizens of Boulder County. Chronically homeless individuals are highly impactful on the public safety net, and that includes emergency rooms, ambulance services, hospitals, and the police. You can see this slide shows you the average visits or contact with each of these types of service that each person has had in the last 6 months. So in the last 6 months, of those people that were VI SPDATed or 225, they've been in the ER almost 3 times. That's a lot. That's every 2 months. That's expensive. Interactions with police over 5, ambulance rides 1. When you think about your own family, you probably haven't had in your household 1 ambulance ride and 3 ER visits in the last 6 months. The estimated cost to Boulder County residents for these services is about $43,000 a year per person, so it gets expensive. We also looked at how the housing market affects permanent supportive housing solutions. I'm sure, as it's no surprise to any of you, housing costs are rising in Boulder County much faster than incomes. A recent Boulder County Human Services report shows that since 2011, rents have risen between 14 and 50%, depending on which community you live in, while incomes have risen just 4% since 2009. So housing costs are way outpacing median incomes. Right now, the Boulder Broomfield average rent from the Metro Denver Rent and Vacancy Survey is over $1,500. If you make $10 an hour, you can afford just over $500 a month. So a third of the average rent. Currently, 59% of Boulder County renters are cost burdened, which means that they pay 30% or more for housing. And this percentage has been rising over the last decade. What does housing availability look like? If we're going to try to put people into permanent supportive housing, where would we put them? Well, vacancy rates in market rate units are less than 5%. 5% is considered market rate equilibrium in a rental market, and so we have a rental market that isn't keeping up with production for the number of renters out there looking for a unit. The vacancy rate drops substantially in price-restricted units, those that have capped rents. It's only 1%, which basically tells you that as soon as someone's moving out, they're cleaning the unit and the person on the waiting list is moving in. We did an analysis of census data and looked at units affordable to a family of 4 who make 30% of the area median income, which is one of the lower income ranges. And in Boulder County, there's been a loss of over 4,000 units in that price range since 2009. And that price point was $750. So you can see that the market is working against people, just low-income people in general, but especially as an agency or a person trying to find a unit if you've been homeless, it's an extra challenge. You might ask why homeless providers aren't just sending people who need permanent supportive housing and chronically homeless people to the housing providers. Well, they are, but unfortunately, there are long waiting lists for their programs. Housing authority waiting lists for units and vouchers are closed or long, over thousands of people on those waiting lists. And one of the things that we learned talking to housing providers was that landlords are becoming less and less likely to take housing vouchers, which are as a rental assistance that goes with a person and they can rent a market rate unit. So as market rates rise, landlords are less likely to take those subsidized vouchers, and those tenants are more likely to raise their rents and rent to a market rate person. And then, of course, a lot of landlords are fixing up properties and flipping them, they're selling them, and there are less units available to the housing authorities and other housing providers than there ever used to be. There are also market constraints to building new units. Housing development hasn't necessarily kept up with demand in Boulder County, which leads to the low vacancy rates and rising prices. We looked at available development parcels throughout the county and found not only high prices, but very few parcels that were available and appropriate to build new housing in any of the markets. Development costs are high, not just in Boulder, but throughout the Metro Denver area, and a developer of permanent supportive housing has to build the same standard as any other developer, thus their housing, their costs per unit are just as high. And I think there are 2 fairly recent projects that we looked at that are affordable. The per unit costs are between $300,000 and $400,000 per unit in total development costs. That's what it takes to build right now.
Talked a bit about the tightness of the housing market, and another very important consideration when you're looking both at the housing market as well as the ability of the housing producers to respond to demand also has to do with government at various levels. Both our federal government, our state government, and of course our local government has tremendous impact on the influence and the cost and availability of housing. Some of the things we've noticed over time at the federal level is that obviously the minimum wage is not keeping up with the cost of living to the extent that people have a livable wage where they can afford housing as well as the other basic essentials in a lot of housing markets, particularly in Colorado. We've also seen, because of the federal budget pressures, that some of the housing programs, the funding has been cut back. There's not as many dollars flowing from the federal government into local communities to assist with dealing with some of the issues around housing affordability. At the state level, we have seen some positive developments, and state monetary resources have increased, and there have been several developments in Boulder County that have benefited from increased appropriations from the state legislature for affordable housing projects. Also, another important factor is when you're dealing with a housing market that deals with permanent supportive housing, it's very critical that both state agencies, local government agencies, and nonprofit agencies have good coordination, because the state agencies have a lot of resources that can be made available to the local level. They also can provide more flexible ways of delivering those resources that can assist both local governments as well as local nonprofits in making sure that benefits and assistance are tailored to the individual needs of the people that they're trying to help. At the local level, we did a general review of local regulations for Boulder County, for the city of Boulder, Lafayette, Longmont, Louisville, Lyons, and Superior. One of the things that's a basic finding, and really to just restate the importance of these local policies, is that the comprehensive plans, the zoning codes, development regulation, building codes, they all influence the ability of housing producers, both for-profit and non-profit housing producers, to supply housing in a cost-effective manner. The comprehensive plan, and I'm sure many of you looked at your comprehensive plan for your jurisdiction, but it's kind of the foundational document for all the policy and regulations that the community develops, and they should flow out of the vision contained in those comp plans. One of the things that we found in looking at the individual comp plans for the municipalities in the county is that most of them lack much detailed discussion at all on affordable housing needs in general, and then when you get to the subset of looking at homeless housing or permanent supportive housing needs, most of them say very little, if anything at all. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. What we looked at in looking at how communities might want to deal with addressing not only their affordable housing needs, but permanent supportive housing needs, is that the comp plan should include some market data indicating in the community what is the demand, what is the supply of housing at various price ranges, particularly when we talk about the affordable sector of the housing market. It should discuss some basic implementation strategies. How is that jurisdiction going to play in trying to balance the demand for housing with people that have the ability to supply it? And then, of course, you want some kind of measurable goals and outcomes that can deal with the countywide need. Also, an important part is dealing with policy commitment that says that municipalities throughout the county and with the county are going to work together to address a variety of housing needs, particularly those housing needs for people with special needs that are the hardest to house. And that's critical, and obviously the consortium has taken this issue up, and this discussion will be very helpful, I think, in helping form a better informed view of kind of how the countywide housing needs are and what the various communities are doing to address those needs. I think also at the community municipal level, a policy commitment to participating in countywide organizations is critical. And there's in addition to the consortium of cities, there's also a consortium that deals particularly with affordable housing, and participation in that needs to be high. Looking at some of the regulations that flow beyond the comprehensive plans, generally what we found in Boulder County and in the municipalities is that the historical land use pattern seems to be at the lower density to medium density level. It's not highly urbanized in any of the municipalities, and that's reality. Most communities have something around a 35-foot building height limit, so that means that you're not going to see development that has tremendous density at 4, 5, 6 stories. Most communities have some kind of multifamily zoning designation, and generally the densest in most multifamily zone districts without special districts that some communities have runs about 14 units per acre, and that's generally considered in planning terms kind of medium density. The city of Boulder and Longmont do have provisions for greater densities in certain zone districts. Diverse housing stock, that's another critical piece, and it's something that I'm sure you've heard nationwide is becoming a very active discussion. Most of the communities that we survey do have something in their comprehensive plan that values a diverse housing stock, and that includes detached and attached housing, manufactured housing, both in parks, on permanent foundations, and accessory dwelling units. And accessory dwelling units is really kind of a fancy name for what we might used to call a granny flat, where you would allow a smaller unit on an existing parcel with a main house. What we found is that none of the jurisdictions presently have regulations allowing tiny houses, which are becoming a very popular housing form in some communities, and also micro rental units. Rental developers in some areas now are moving to creating smaller, generally around 400 square foot, single person rental units as a way of keeping the development costs down, but also providing a lower rent to the people that need it. And the basic conclusion is that smaller housing units is one way to lower costs. In looking at some of the solutions around the planning and regulatory issue, the comprehensive plans I think could benefit from having some language and some focus on affordable housing, homeless, and definitely permanent supportive housing. Some communities provide through their policies a menu of incentives, and incentives are basically ways of helping create the conditions to get more development of a particular type of housing. Sometimes those incentives can be cash. Communities can make an award. They may have a special fund. They may have a trust fund that they can provide money for, or also they can provide what are called non-cash incentives. And sometimes when you're dealing with the regulatory system, if the community is willing to look at reducing parking requirements for a certain type of housing, or maybe allowing a little bit more flexibility in how certain connectivity and accessibility requirements are dealt with, that can in the end be just like cash, because it helps the developer lower the cost of that housing. The other thing that's important too is that particularly when you're dealing with a challenging housing product like permanent supportive housing, that communities and planning departments can have a value of flexibility and say that we're going to work. We know that this population, the demands for this housing, how it gets built, the characteristics of this housing may require us to provide some greater flexibility than we would for just traditional attached housing product. Another thing, of course, that we've seen in Boulder County, and I think probably everyone in this room is well aware, is that there's just right now a tremendous shortage of what we call greenfield land, which is raw land that's suitable for development that probably has decent access to water and sewer utilities. And I think because of the market conditions, we don't see them changing radically. Boulder County and the municipalities are going to have to look at doing some creative and unconventional things, and that can include looking for places to build housing that traditionally haven't been used. For instance, you might couple some rental housing units with the new fire station. Or there may be a parking lot that could be cut in half and some structural parking could be added and some housing could build. Also, a very exciting development going on is there are several organizations that we've come across in the county that are working with some of the churches that are trying to use some church land as a way of developing some housing. So all those are kind of exciting options. The other thing that we noticed, and again, in a situation that, I mean, land is like gold in Boulder County, but there really is no kind of general itemized awareness of what exactly is available. There are parcels out there. What would it take to bring them online? Do they have good access to infrastructure? And we are recommending that countywide, people start spending some energy and looking at trying to put together an inventory of buildable parcels. Obviously, it has to have some base within the municipality because, again, it has to tie back into the planning and zoning requirements in that community. But as a countywide view, it would definitely speed things up for developers if they knew some good, strong parcels that might be available, or using some of these creative ways of adding housing to other existing public facilities. Another thing that's critically important, and tonight starts this, is to continue to discuss adding housing for the chronically homeless, and hopefully that discussion, communities that maybe haven't perceived that as a pressing need in the community, in the county, will start to understand that even their communities have some of those needs. Another important thing that could be done, and this has been talked about in a number of contexts over the years, but some communities have monetary resources. In some of the other communities, there is a little higher availability of land that might be used for development, and there may be opportunities through some intergovernmental agreements for folks with some monetary funds to help get housing done in a community that doesn't have a lot of general fund money to put into it, but may be willing to encourage the use of some land that's zoned properly in that community. Incentives, and again, this is an important piece. Providing incentives, those can be cash, they can be non-cash, they can be donation of land, infrastructure assistance, it can be waivers of certain fees. Sometimes communities, because of both federal regulations and their own local regulations, are unable to just waive certain utility fees. Some communities will find the means to backfill those enterprise funds with funds from some other source. Boulder County, the city of Boulder, and Longmont all have affordable housing policies which do provide a menu of incentives that they're willing to provide for projects which meet a specific criteria. And that's important too. You know, the community needs to target the priority, and that goes back to your comprehensive plan. If you identify those priority needs, then you can start to address at the policy level what incentives might be available to help address that need. The other cities have participated in various affordable housing projects, but basically at a policy and regulatory level, that support has been done on more of an ad hoc basis based upon an individual development request. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about types of housing and who they might serve.
One of the things that we wanted to do was make recommendations about the best ways to serve various homeless populations in Boulder County, and really looking at the housing market, the needs, what we know about certain populations, and the best ways to house them. And so these next few slides just go through that, and I'm not going to go into the detail. But when we look at individuals as a population, our recommendation is that One of the best ways to serve them is 100% permanent supportive housing buildings. There are a variety of ways that you can provide permanent supportive housing. You can provide vouchers where someone goes out and finds a unit in a private apartment building. But as we know, vouchers, it's tough to use them right now. Landlords aren't so apt to take them, and so that's not as great of a solution to meet our 225 plus demand as some other ideas. Set-asides of units within a building, that's another strategy that's a good one. But for individuals, a lot of times they have such chronic needs that having a building that has been set aside for those individuals, that just has really intense services and only serves one population, we feel like is probably the best solution for individuals. Families, we talk to a lot of providers who serve families and have chronically homeless families in their homeless population, and they really feel like scattered site set-asides of units within one building is the best way to serve families. That way a family can have an assisted rent and only pay 30% of their income for rent, and get services, but they can also be around other families, they can be near schools, they can be in a property that's a little more appropriate for their children, and it's good for those kids to be interacting with their kids. Youth on their own, which by the way, the age for youth on their own technically goes up to 24 when we're talking about permanent supportive housing. We also feel like 100% permanent supportive housing building is best for this population as well. And the reason is that many youth on their own need intensive case management and a lot of the same services that other individuals need, but a lot of them are coming out of foster care and other situations in the public system, and they need a lot of support that really deals with them and their situation and moving out on your own and getting a job, going to school, and some other things that other chronically homeless individuals who may also be older, We looked at pros and cons of each of these three strategies. Scattered site pros are that it's flexible. You could find yourself a unit where you want to be. It's near transit, perhaps. And you could try to find a unit that's near your providers. But a con is that it's tough to do this right now in the Boulder housing market. Set aside of units within one building is also a good idea. You could be near public transportation, but if you're in some areas of the county, you may not be near your service provider, and that's a con. 100% permanent supportive housing buildings. Clients, the nice thing here is that clients usually can access all their services within the building, or many of the services. A lot of these, if they're newly constructed, are constructed with offices for service providers, so that those service providers can actually have office hours within the property. They can be developed and designed with high security systems, a front desk. They can have materials that are built that are a little tougher to take some beating, and those are all the pros. Best communities for each solution, really any of these could happen anywhere. Most likely 100% permanent supportive housing building would be in Boulder or Longmont, where many of the service providers are located. And Tom touched on small group homes, I think, and we're going to go into an example of that. The nice thing about a solution like a house, where you may have a small group of people living together that's 100% permanent supportive housing, is that those can go anywhere throughout the county. We were asked to come up with, I think as I mentioned earlier, some solutions, some basic overall solutions for what could happen in Boulder County. Yes, you have a tough housing market and you have chronically homeless people, but it doesn't mean you can't tackle this problem and come up with some great solutions. So some of the best practices and suggestions that we have that we've modeled are acquisition of an existing rental unit, a property anywhere in the county. The nice thing about these is they're zoned correctly, and they can be flexible. You could pick up a property that has an elevator if you have a population that has physical disabilities, and it can be a little less costly than new development. Looking for sites that are zoned for housing zoning category where housing would be allowed, but it's not necessarily a multifamily zoning category, is also a great solution. I just forgot the name of the organization, not Boulder Shelter, the Bridge House has a great example, thank you, of a commercial building that they turned into housing. And it's transitional housing, but that same model could be used for permanent supportive housing. We looked at some sites, and there definitely are some sites on the edges of jurisdictions that could be annexed into those jurisdictions and rezoned, and maybe aren't as close to dense neighborhoods that would be appropriate. As we've talked about, there's single family homes could be used with a group home style, larger homes, anywhere throughout the county. And as Tom touched on, sites, buildable sites that are owned by governments and nonprofit organizations are also a great solution. So here are some examples. This is an acquisition of an existing building. This is not a building in Boulder County. It is in Colorado, but it's just a building. And the good thing about acquisition of existing rentals, as we said, is it can happen in any community. Costs are a little less, zoning's in place. Some of the units could be converted into community spaces and offices for staff. One of the downsides is that financing might all have to be local. If the property isn't big enough, some of the larger financing sources might not be able to be used for something like this. But it's still a very feasible solution. Single-family homes. Throughout Boulder County, group home zoning allows for between 3 and 10 people to live together without asking for special permission. One of the examples that we put in our report is Sue's House, which is in Las Cruces, New Mexico. The homeless organization down there actually owns 2 houses, one for men and one for women. They each have about 8 people living in 5 bedrooms each. They're 3 bath, 5 bedroom homes, I think. And that project was financed with HUD funding and local money, and has a staff person who lives on site with the people. So it works out very well. And that could be done anywhere throughout Boulder. Here's a tiny home development. As Tom said, tiny homes are all the rage. This project is in Olympia, Washington. And this, it should be noted, is a permanent housing solution. These tiny homes, and an example like this is not people who are rolling a tiny home onto a lot and moving around like a campground. This is an intentional development, actually, where there was a homeless camp, where the city went in and put in infrastructure, put in foundations. These units have 130 square feet, so they're small. They actually only have half baths, refrigerators, and microwaves. But then there's a large community building. It has showers, it has a kitchen, it has all the offices for staff, and all the different support organizations come there and provide services. So each individual gets their own little tiny house. And this is actually a lower cost solution than building some other rental developments. New construction with a land lease. This is going along the lines of what Tom was talking about with using church land. In fact, there are 2 best practice projects. One, Attention Home, that's starting off in Boulder, and one, St. Francis Apartments in Denver, that's being built on a church site. And the nice thing about these developments, or this idea of using public land, church land, nonprofit land, whatever it is where you might get a land lease for free and donated land, is that reduces your construction costs. It also may help you find a site that's close to services in town, a site that might not be available for other development, but that there's a organization or a government with an interest in providing this type of housing. And the St. Francis development in Denver is a good example. It's large enough where they can use some of the financing sources like low-income housing tax credits that really bring a lot of equity into a project. One of the things about building permanent supportive housing is that they really can't carry debt if it's going to be 100% permanent supportive housing project, or it's very hard to carry debt because you have low-income people, you're trying to provide some of the services through your operating costs, and it just makes it really hard to cover the cost of operating a property and servicing debt. example of a 100% permanent supportive housing new construction project, and best practices are the Hill and Boulder. The Kestrel is actually a mixed property with that set aside. That's the Boulder County Housing Authority building in Louisville. And there are a variety of other examples, including Vida Nueva that we highlighted in our report. These are newly constructed units, usually have service rooms and providers on site. You can have permanent supportive 100% permanent supportive housing, or in the case of Kestrel, that property has 20%, whoever's heard from Boulder Hub, 20% homeless set aside, and then the rest is an affordable family